Well, good.
So go for it.
Okay, sure thing. Well, thank you, Andrew. Sorry about that. Don't know what was happening.
Sure, no problem.
Zoom. Can't wait till it's over. Well, good evening, everybody. We're joining you here tonight from South Carolina and from Sugar Land, Texas. I probably met a number of you in earlier proceedings on this project. We're here tonight to catch you up on Module 2, which is the second phase of the drafting process. I'm joined tonight by Kelly Cousineau, who's here in our Charleston office.
Hi there.
She's an urban planner. We also have David Baird, who's a planner and attorney in Sugar Land.
Hello.
And we are, let's see, I'm going to get a little slideshow going here. We've got a lot of material to cover tonight. So our plan will be to proceed through our presentation. Our goal is to cover each of the topics that have been taken on in Module 2, particularly the big ones we'll cover in more detail, and we'll insert some breaks throughout the process that allow for questions or comments as we go, since there is a lot of material. I want to cover briefly where we've been to get to this point, and what we can expect tonight in Module 2, and then what we can expect from here on out in the project. Most of you will recall that we kicked this off about a year ago with 2 days of stakeholder meetings in Amarillo. Dave and Kelly and I were there along with my partner, Mark White. And we spent 2 days with city staff members, members of the community, Planning and Zoning Commission, and the council, going over what all this project was going to entail. And then in September, we summarized all of that, what we heard in essence in the zoning ordinance assessment. We brought that back to you to say, here's what we heard you wanted. Did we get it right? And I think we got it mostly right. To the extent we didn't, we revised it. And at that point, we set off on making the revisions to the code and hitting those things that were in Module 1, which we brought to you in February. We're here to discuss Module 2 tonight. This has been about a 1.5 year long project. We're a year into it, and we're on course to finish up by December. I'd like to, one day I'm going to redo this slide to be more like a triangle, because that's the way we approach the drafting process. Module 1 is the base of the triangle. This is the zoning districts and the use tables and the use regulations, which make up the foundation of the zoning program in Amarillo. We also include in there these days an executive summary and an introduction chapter. As you'll remember from our discussions in February, the goal here is that any user of the code, whether it's an individual property owner or a repeat applicant like a developer, can open the code and easily know where to go to know what they need to do what it is they'd like to do with their property. So moving up from that point, we're now in Module 2. And at Module 2, we start adding on development standards and building on that base of zoning. David's going to touch on tonight a number of these things, as will Kelly. David's also going to touch on the historic preservation overlay, which is a topic we've covered in Module 2. Now, in Module 1, I noted that we have covered the zoning districts and the uses, but we didn't propose any changes to the zoning map at that point. We wanted to get the text in place. Tonight, Kelly will walk us through some proposed changes to the zoning map itself. And then after tonight, we'll move into Module 3. And that is going to be procedures and administration of the code. We'll deal with non-conforming uses and structures at that time. How we'll deal with properties that are today compliant, but with the new code, they would not be compliant, but are allowed to continue on legally nonetheless. Our definition section is an important section of the code. It may seem a bit mundane to the average person, but it's a critical piece. And that's a part that we've revised as we've gone along. So when we were there in February, we presented the definition section as it existed at that point. And that's also been posted to the website to show changes that are necessary to the definition section based on our changes to Module 2. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly now. Kelly has been our principal drafter, so she's going to walk us through Module 2 changes. Are there any questions to this point about how we've gotten to this place in the study?
If anyone has questions, hit raise hand on your Zoom application, or you can also dial *9 if you've called in for the meeting, and then I'll be able to unmute you if you have a question. Doesn't look like we have any right now.
Okay, Kelly, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to start with the project website, which most of y'all have probably seen, but it is where we've posted all of the draft documents related to the project, Module 1 and Module 2. I just wanted to run through real quick what's posted online. The first item here, the revisions overview, is a short summary of that hits on kind of the major changes in Article 4. The next one here is the text of the ordinance for the development standards article, and going along with that is the parking standards table. Also the historic preservation overlay, the draft zoning map that Tyson mentioned that we'll take a look at towards the end of the presentation. The definition section, which Tyson mentioned, we've been modifying as we go along, and we'll finalize that in Module 3. There's also an annotated outline, which we did towards the beginning of the project, that lays out the new format for the code and which existing zoning sections would go to which section of the revised ordinance. That's also covered in a lot more detail in this last document that's listed, the revisions tracking. That's just a big Excel spreadsheet that tracks, it lists all of the existing zoning ordinance sections and tells you where they have been relocated in the new ordinance. And with that, I will get into Article 4, development standards. It covers the topics that are listed here on the screen. The area and bulk regulations, those are actually established in other articles of the ordinance, but this section, the section in the development standards article, describes how to calculate and measure things like setbacks and lot area. This article also covers landscaping and screening, outdoor lighting, parking, performance standards, and then we are developing regulations pertaining to parks, which we will present to y'all in Module 3. And then the city's current sign ordinance is a separate chapter in the code right now, and so we've consolidated it with the zoning ordinance, but the current regulations are carried forward with no changes. So there's a number of revisions and changes related to development standards, and we're going to hit kind of the top 10. And then also included in this list is the historic preservation overlay and the zoning map. So we'll go through all of these items in more detail. Starting with the area and bulk regulations I mentioned. All of these standards are like height, lot area, setbacks are established in Article 2 zoning districts and Article 3 use regulations. And so this division makes sure that you know how to measure and calculate all of those things. Starting with measurement of height, we are proposing some changes to the way the city currently measures height to make it more consistent with the International Building Code, the IBC. The city currently measures height based on the average grade of the front yard or the average grade at the street line to various points depending on the type of roof on the building. But the code's not clear about how you find that average grade. So we've proposed to measure from grade plane, which is a concept that's defined in the building code, and it's one that architects and developers are accustomed to working with. And so the height measurement in feet applies primarily to accessory structures like carports. The zoning districts regulate height in number of stories. And so since this is the sort of the most commonly used measurement in terms of height, we've added this new graphic to depict what constitutes a story, again, consistent with the IBC, and then clarified in what instances attics and basements are included, and that is consistent with the city's current code. Mentioned we added new graphics. We've also updated a number of the city's existing graphics, like these related to the measurement of lot width and lot depth, as well as setbacks and exceptions to setback requirements, such as the ones shown on the right that show the applicable setbacks for corner lots. We've also added some new graphics related to zero lot line development. These are existing standards in the code, and we're carrying these forward, but felt like it was important to add a graphic here. And then also in this section about measurements and calculations is calculating residential density, which was a metric that was introduced in Module 1. The city currently regulates density through minimum lot area. And we're proposing to maintain that technique for the agricultural and single-family residential zoning districts. There's a provision that says 1 dwelling per lot, but all of these districts also have a minimum lot area, which controls the number of dwelling units or houses allowed per acre of land. And then when you get into the moderate and higher density residential districts, as well as some of the lower intensity commercial districts that allow residential uses, there's no minimum lot area specified, but there is a minimum and maximum density in the case of the MD and NS districts. And then in multifamily and some of the other commercial districts, there's a maximum density only. So this section of the code provides 2 example calculations, one for minimum density and one for maximum density. Just takes an example, say you're in the moderate density district with a multiple family building type, and this just walks you through the calculation to get to the maximum density for that use in that particular district. Another measurement covered in this section is lot coverage, and there is a fairly significant change here. The city currently calculates lot area as a percentage, lot coverage as a percentage of lot area covered by a roof, floor, or other structure. Proposed is to include all impervious surfaces in the calculation of lot coverage. So this would, in addition to structures, add in hardscape elements like parking lots. And this change implements a comprehensive plan strategy tied lot coverage to character intent. There's the current zoning districts don't differentiate. There's not a lot of difference in the zoning districts in terms of the maximum lot coverage. There are some higher limits in the more intensive commercial districts, but this sort of 50% lot coverage across the board is one of the reasons why you don't see a significant difference in development character as you move through different areas of the city. So limiting lot coverage and including impervious surfaces in that calculation of lot coverage benefits community appearance. It maintains more green space on lots and in between buildings. It can reduce the heat island effect that contributes to higher temperatures in summertime. And one of the most important things is that it reduces the volume and rate of stormwater runoff, particularly from commercial sites that have more substantial paved surfaces. And before I turn it over to David, I'll pause and see if there's any questions on that first section.
Just a quick reminder for new folks that have logged in, if you have any questions, you can hit the raise hand button in Zoom, or if you're calling in from your phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand. Got a question from Tim. Okay, Tim, you're unmuted. Oop. I'm trying to unmute you.
How about, can you hear me now?
There you go. Now we can hear you.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
When you look at lot coverage and you're talking about the benefits of, rainwater runoff, things like that, are you looking at the effects on development cost for developers or for other people building? Because it sounds like if you were previously looking at that based on roof and building height, and now you're going to incorporate drainage of impervious surfaces, then wouldn't that also increase the cost in general of doing development by making this change?
Well, do you believe that that's the case?
I mean, my just superficial reading of it, I haven't done that many developments where that would apply yet, but my superficial reading of it is that yes, it would increase the cost because you have to meet higher minimum thresholds to have a functioning site plan.
Okay.
So, I mean, I know that you're saying it meets one of the goals, but if it also then meets a goal, which is increasing the cost of new development, isn't that also counter to the goal potentially of a comprehensive plan? I don't know.
Well, we can give that some thought. I'm not sure I would conclude that it increases the overall cost without doing a bit more of an analysis.
Okay.
But absolutely open to that point. If you can you provide us maybe just, and I'm not saying anything particularly sophisticated, but feel free to pass along to Andrew maybe some rough numbers of what you're talking about.
Okay. Yep.
That'd be helpful.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it.
No. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to David.
Yeah, so with landscaping and screening, currently in your code today, there's a term that's not being used. It's called Bufferyard standards. You refer to them as screening, but there's no real, in the existing code, there's no connection with how incompatible one use is versus another and how large those buffer or screening standards need to be. So I'll get to that a little bit more. But for now, there are really two main types of buffer yards. There's what we call a structural and a natural buffer yard. A natural is just exactly what it says, is that it's natural vegetation, whereas structural includes a fence or a wall. So another thing that we've looked at here is you have a landscape point system, which essentially doesn't mandate some things, but you have to meet a certain point total before you're able to get approval. So we've added some additional options as potential ways you can get points. A few of those are buyer retention, and then what I mean by increased rate of trees is basically a statement that says, you know, you have to have for every 20 parking spaces you have a tree. Well, if you were to up that and do even higher, then that would allow for more of the landscape, you know, to meet more of the system. So also with right now, there's not a maximum height regulation for fences and walls, which means that you can actually create a really large structure in a residential area. So we've addressed that with the maximum height regulations. Next slide, please. So for the buffer yards, like I was mentioning, the structural and the natural, I want to kind of go through how this table works. What you see on the left side is referred to as type A structural buffer yard. So structural, again, it includes the wall and the fence. It includes the 5-foot width. And then how to read this table is the number, if you look at the items that say large trees, evergreen trees, ornamental trees, if you have that wall and the fence, then you can use the lower number for the natural, which would be or the lower number being the structural. So you would only need one large tree or one evergreen tree instead of the two natural in this case. So again, the example you see is the type A structure. The type B or the type D is the most intensive. So with that, next slide, please, Kelly. So if you see when I was referring to the degree of incompatibility, what I mean by that is when, let's say you're developing an industrial in the I-2 zoning district and it's you know, a heavy industrial use, that's when the most intensive buffer yard would need to be used. So that's how these two tables, they're in the same section of the code and they very much work hand in hand together. So with that, next slide, please, Kelly. I mentioned maximum height. This is the table that refers to that, just to ensure that, again, we don't have any extremely large structures in residential areas. Also regulated in this portion is the minimum setback line. We've allowed for an accommodation for when you have a sidewalk out front and when you don't have a sidewalk. Those are different standards. Next slide, please, Kelly. Oh, so with that, I think I should stop and ask if there are any questions.
Looks like we got one from Gabe. One second, Gabe. You should be able to unmute yourself now, Gabe.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Okay, so going back to the buffer yards, how does this apply to properties that are already in existence, been next door to an industrial use next door to a house for the last 50 years?
So if there wasn't like a new site plan or a new large redevelopment on the property, it's not like it would apply retroactively. It's not like you would have to add anything, but there would be a certain threshold where that would kick in. But without any type of development, you wouldn't be required to add buffer yard.
To go inside, I mean, development meaning like adding on to a building, or like asking for a remodeling permit for the building?
Yeah, let me get into the draft, and so I'm not misspeaking on that. Okay. I don't think we've actually really fleshed out. Let's see. We do have an exemption section. Deals with some.
There's the applicability section too, David. I think that gets at his question.
Are you seeing that on page 42 of the draft, or?
It's 32 in my draft, but it's section 410-146.
146. Okay. Yeah, that's actually outside of, because I guess that would apply to all the site standard requirements. Yeah. Yeah, so it would be for all new construction projects, redevelopment projects resulting in an increase of 3,000 square feet or 35% or more of the gross floor area of the building. And then when you have an expansion of an existing parking lot, when the parking lot's enlarged by more than 30%, that's when it would apply. Any follow-ups on that or other questions?
Yeah, so
Go ahead, Tim.
from my understanding, what you're saying is even in an industrial site, a new construction would then require a buffer yard for that industrial site. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, a new construction, yes.
Okay, and I guess the idea there is beautification of the industrial site, right? I mean, is that
Well, it's really more to protect the adjoining property from the impacts of the industrial site.
okay? I mean, okay. I mean, I think another potential way to handle that could be nuisances, you know, if there was a nuisance claim against the owner. But once again, if you mandate it and it has to be done, then once again, it increases the cost of development. So I personally don't see the benefit in it per se, but that's, you know.
Sure. Well, one thing, this is really a more of an approach to protect, neighboring properties. One thing we're very open to is getting some feedback from you on, on how large the buffers are. Those really change based on community to community. So, at a certain point, I can understand how, there would be a real increase in development costs with too much buffering maybe. And what I will say is that really varies from community to community as we work across the country. How much buffering is required from an industrial use to a residential use. I think the city is going to get some complaints without any. But I think if you have any comments specifically designed about, where there might be too high of a level in your opinion, I think that'd be really good to send to Andrew, because we're real happy to look at revising that.
And I think too, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but the buffer yards are an alternative to the fences and walls that are required anyways, right?
That is true. It is an alternative. So that's, gives you some flexibility with how to use it.
One second, I think Gabe's got another question. Go ahead, Gabe.
So what on our existing codes, I mean, going back to existing fencing being a requirement, is that a chain link fence, unscreened, in between property owners? That's kind of question number one, but I'd comment on or tail into Tim's comments, which is, going back to your grid here, the boundary buffer yard standards is maybe we, again, where you put an A under I2 zoning versus I1 zoning, those type of zoning uses don't care about anything more than security. I would go as far as say all of them except for maybe a residential application next door to a commercial of any sort application is your only time that it would step up, or that a neighbor would want a buffer yard. Obviously, again, commercial businesses against commercial businesses, they want plenty of reciprocations. I'm sorry, that's two kind of, one part being a question, the other part being just the commentary that it may be too stringent the way y'all laid it out.
Yeah, and I'm happy to take a look at that. I will say that there are some communities that do look at buffering even between like residential uses or between certain types of commercial uses. That may not be something that city staff is seeing as an issue in Amarillo. It may be that it could be an area of revision. I'm really happy to receive any written comments on that, because again, where the actual amount of buffering as we do these projects across the country, it really varies from community to community on what the standard ends up being. So I think that's a good comment.
Gabe, did that answer your question?
It satisfied the comment, but what about the question of is when you're next to industrial or another commercial use, is the existing code, is that just for an unscreened fence, chain link obvious, or is what's the current code?
Under today's standards?
Correct.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
see.
Chris, are you still online? That may be
I
a
am.
better question for you than
Yeah,
me.
basically, when you have a a non-residential use that is developed immediately adjacent to a residential district, the screening fence is required to be wood or masonry and at least 6 feet tall. That is the current requirement.
Is that even in industrial zoned areas?
If the industrial property is being developed and it is adjacent to a residential district, which is ag, R1, R2, R3, or manufactured home, a 6-foot solid wood or masonry fence is required. That is current code.
Is that what you were asking, Gabe?
Yes, thank you for that. It sounded like it was just under new construction.
Okay. Andrew, you seeing any other hands raised or?
No.
Okay. Sally Forth.
Okay. Well, we'll move into parking, which is Division 5 in Article 4. It largely carries forward the current requirements. We have updated all of the minimum parking ratios and created a table that lists all of the same uses that are in the land use table that's in the zoning districts article. So every use that's listed there is also listed in the parking schedule. We've also proposed a maximum parking ratio that's 125% of the minimum required for a particular use. There is some allowance for building expansion or the expansion of seating area at a restaurant. If you expand less than 35% of the floor area or seating area, there's no additional parking required. There's also an allowance or a reduction for infill lots. The infill lots are defined, but you can automatically receive a 20% reduction in the minimum if you're developing on an infill lot. We've also added provisions for administrative adjustments, which allow the planning director to adjust the minimum or the maximum ratio by up to 10% for new development, redevelopment, and change of use, and then by up to 20% for historic landmarks and contributing structures. We've also added a procedure for the planning director to determine the parking requirements for any unlisted uses, and it follows the same process that was established in the zoning districts article for land uses. We've also added some new incentives for what we're calling adaptive reuse. So these incentives would be available for existing buildings that are located in an adopted neighborhood plan area where the building is either at least 20 years old, classified as a dangerous structure as defined in the city code, or it's a vacant building that hasn't been occupied for more than 3 years. If your building meets those requirements, you're eligible for a 50% reduction in the minimum amount of parking required. There's also an allowance for off-site parking to be located on a non-adjacent lot, provided it's located within a quarter mile of the building. So that expands the requirement that's currently in the code that allows off-site parking, but it requires it to be on an adjacent lot or a lot across an alley. And then finally, there's an allowance for up to 50% of the required parking to be accommodated in a public parking lot, as long as it's located within a quarter mile of the building. And this is a provision that's going to require staff to do some tracking so that any space that has been allocated for a particular business is not allocated to multiple businesses. And let me stop there and see if there's any questions on parking.
Yeah, I have a number of questions. One is, first off, when you're saying staff needs to look at whether or not a building is within a quarter-mile radius, is there any accommodation there for the type of use? So for example, if you have a residential where usually the parking is taking place in the evening versus an office space where usually the parking is most required during the day, I mean, it seems like it would make sense to at least take that into consideration when determining whether or not there's enough parking space. And then secondly, I'm not sure if this is the right space for this comment, but I'm vice chair of the pedestrian bike committee, and we're looking at road diets as ways to improve a pedestrian feel, provide other amenities. And so I'm wondering what the right mechanism is for having a way to adopt angled parking on existing city streetscapes to sort of partner with a development plan, because I think it's very crucial for any urban redevelopment that there's angled parking that can be created ideally through city road diets. So if you can speak to either of those questions.
Sure, I'll speak to both of them. I'll take the second one first. It's my understanding that, well, the current code doesn't allow required parking to be accommodated in the right of way. We have not proposed any changes to that at this point. I think that's because it's city right of way, that's gonna be a city decision, but that's certainly something that we could accommodate in this section for adaptive reuse or potentially other areas. Then your first question about shared parking, there is a section in the parking division specifically addressing shared parking, and it does allow it in a neighborhood plan area, so it would be available not necessarily just for adaptive reuse situations as we've defined it here, but for any let me see how it's written, a non-residential district located on an arterial or collector street and within the boundaries of an adopted neighborhood plan area. So that would accommodate what you were suggesting. And these shared parking regulations, in addition to the neighborhood plan areas, would also or could also apply for mixed use developments, retail or shopping centers, office, business, or industrial parks, as well as medical campuses or school campuses.
Okay. So still I'm just trying to think through this. I currently own four buildings now, very close to owning 4 buildings that would encompass a bar, a restaurant, a potential office space, and then kind of like a shop, an industrial shop. So, and I have a parking lot with 20 spaces probably on it. So so I'd have to look through the uses for each one of those buildings, and then taking into account the shared parking lot, and then adding in what potential street parking in the perimeter within a quarter mile. Is that how it would be calculated? Or I'm just trying to think through how this is actually quantified.
Sure. Well, the shared parking specifically requires, and I guess we need to clarify, there's a difference between a shared parking lot that accommodates the minimum number of spaces required for each individual use it serves. But in the context of the code, when we say shared parking, we're talking about essentially a reduction in the total number of spaces allowed because of what you said earlier, businesses and residential potentially having different peak parking demand times.
Yeah.
But it sounds like if you have 4 uses, it sounds like the uses that you just mentioned could potentially be eligible for that shared parking reduction and having different hours of operation. So in that case, you, as the applicant, and let me make sure I'm speaking correctly. Yep. So as the applicant, you would you would contract with an engineer, transportation planner to do a shared parking analysis that demonstrates those different hours of operation. And then the planning director would have the ability to reduce the number of required spaces based on the results of your analysis.
Okay. And just as a follow-up comment, I'm not sure the right place, and I've discussed it with mainly with the pedestrian bike committee, but I do think ideally somewhere in the zoning rewrite, we should look at angled parking as a strategy on city right-of-way for redevelopment promotion. I think it's extremely important, personally. So just as an aside.
Noted. Okay. Any other questions on parking?
Okay, so yes, this is Gabe Irving here. Yeah, I absolutely would agree with the angled parking discussion in any way possible. Downtown's a little bit limited towards it, but it seems like we pushed against it a couple of years back, and obviously that'd be an avenue of doubling or close to the amount of off-street parking we have. But with Tim's comments, he made a good point. You know, he has multiple properties that have multiple uses, and this kind of goes back to our last meeting, which is, you know, the confining of the uses or trying to make them fit into smaller columns instead of broader columns, you know, could be detrimental to what he's trying to do. Now, I definitely, obviously, am pushing for the broader side. But I would hope that'd be a good example that, you know, as you guys recollect on this deal, that you see that we really need to be going for as many options as we can go for, everything from industrial uses to restaurant uses, which are the two, unfortunately, opposite ends of the spectrums when it comes to parking. But there's only really 4 areas of Amarillo that are so market driven, let's say parking inadequacies. Downtown is obviously one of them. The 6th Street, Route 66 corridor is another one. The Emerald Boulevard is being heavily limited, especially Emerald Boulevard East in the strong retail corridor, as well as Grand Street, just because of the expansion of the multiple lanes of Grand Street has eaten into a lot of pre-existing parking lots. So those 4 areas I see are areas that need, let's say, some parking ratio forgiveness. You might call it, I don't know. I know I mentioned earlier today in the P&Z meeting about 6th Street has multiple buildings that do not even have a single inch of land other than the building that it sits on. And I would heavily push still for that area to have a 0 requirement, just like the downtown areas have for parking, in order for us to meet some of the guidelines to, you know, putting businesses into the vacant buildings. But like I said, Grand Street is seeing another, and Emerald Boulevard both are seeing the limitations of the market's improving, but the buildings are 50 years old or 30 years old, and were done before parking requirements were a major event. That's my comment.
Thanks, Gabe.
Any more questions, Andrew? Okay.
No.
Okay. I'm going to move on to outdoor lighting, which is Division 4 of Article 4. This is new for the city. It applies to new development in multiple family as well as the commercial districts. There are some exemptions built in, including for 1 and 2 family dwellings, ornamental architectural lighting, and temporary lighting, such as that related to a special event or a construction site. There are also special provisions for high intensity and special purpose lighting, for example, for industrial uses or sports fields. Essentially, they're not required to meet the standards in this section, but they do have to demonstrate that there have been attempts made to limit light spillover and glare onto adjacent properties. There is a requirement that lighting within 300 feet of a building used for residential purposes to be turned off between 10 p.m. and 6 p.m. or 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., excuse me, except for security lighting. And again, this is just to address nuisances, glare, lighting spillover. The total amount of lighting on a site is not limited by the zoning ordinance. It is, however, limited by building code. The IECC specifies individual lighting power allowances for building exteriors, and those already apply. They're part of the building code. So what is regulated in this section is the amount of light at the lot lines. So we've proposed maximum vertical illuminance levels at the lot line based on the adjacent zoning district. Freestanding fixtures would be limited to 15 feet in height and have to be set back at least 5 feet from the lot lines. And then lights that are on the brighter end with 1500 lumens or more have to be fully shielded, as shown in the illustration here on the right-hand side of the slide. And finally, the correlated color temperature is limited to 3000 Kelvin or less. And this has to do really with the color. Lighting that's less than 3000 kelvins is more on the warm amber spectrum of light, whereas lighting that's greater than 3000 Kelvin gets into more of the cool blue light spectrum. If y'all have ever been driving down the road and seen those cars with the really bright, almost blue looking headlights, that's what we're talking about with a correlated color temperature, just keeping it again on the warmer amber side, which is easier on the eyes. And I'll ask if there's questions on outdoor lighting before I turn it back to David.
Sorry, I missed the exact introduction to this, but I'm wondering how this at all applies to Dodds in general, because Dodds currently has, I'm pretty sure, a very high Kelvin. I mean, the lights for the Dodds district are very white, and it's right on the streetscape. And as someone who's looked at or thought about maybe developing, let's say, 2-story row houses or something within the Dodds boundary, I feel like the requirement of the Dodds lighting would be sort of a problem for that, because it would be a lot of white light coming into bedroom windows and things like that. So I'm just wondering, does this apply to the Dodds zone? And if so, it looks like it's actually crossroads with the actual Dodds requirements.
That's a good comment. It does apply in the CD, the Central Business District. Yep. Which obviously that falls within the Dodds. But that's something that we could take a look at if there needs to be some special requirements or exemptions for the downtown overlay.
I mean, I would say I would probably prefer this recommendation here to have the warmer colors and more downlighting over what's currently enforced in Dodds. Probably.
I gotcha. Okay.
But just in general, I think Dodds personally I don't see how it applies very well to a multi-story residential use, because the lights are, potentially right outside of a window at a pretty high height and a very high Kelvin, or a very white light. So.
Okay, we can definitely take a look at how it compares.
This is Gabe Irving again, and unfortunately Tim and I are on too much of the same page. Last thing y'all need is us having coffee together one day.
Yep.
But I'll say that there's two things in that manner, which is also it's an unshielded light fixture that's on the street lamps. We have it in place today facing hotels, which is the same as residential, or applications at least. And then that 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. scenario, again, you wouldn't want that in downtown as a good specific example. I'm trying to think of other examples, but ultimately you have, bars and restaurants that are open till commercial applications, let's call it, that are open until midnight, 2 a.m. that would conflict with the 10 p.m. requirement to shut them down. So just things to think about.
Okay. We'll definitely take a look at that. Thank you. Okay, well, I will turn it back to David for performance standards and historic preservation.
Sure. So before I start on this last portion, I'll say that my internet was kind of flickering in and out during Kelly's presentation on outdoor lighting. So if I get cut off, I'll call in via my phone and just do it from that. But it's looking pretty good right now, so hopefully we can make it through. On the performance standards, we're really just updating based on some modern trends, nothing real substantial in this. The biggest difference is, and you can look at this on the applicability chart, is that for the 6 different things that we're regulating in here, currently it's only regulated in the industrial district. Whereas what we're proposing in here is for the noise regulations, the smoke and particulate matter, and the vibration regulations would go into the residential districts as well. The intent of these regulations are really looking at the impacts of a use in an industrial district. However, with the noise and vibration and the smoke and particulate matter, those impacts, of course, could be felt in the residential area. So that's one change there. Any questions on that before I move on to historic? Okay. Not seeing anyone jump in there. So Kelly, we can.
Gabe, is your hand up?
Gabe.
Oh, we did have somebody. I'm sorry.
I think I'm unmuted. So yes, so again, how would this apply? Thank you for going back on pre-existing. And I know y'all are trying to change the districts and stuff, but on a pre-existing deal that was built 50 years ago next door to a residential.
Looking at the applicability standard, right, or the section right now. So do you currently own the industrial use, or are you wondering if the industrial use would be, if the impacts were felt in the residential district, could there be a citation, or are you wondering if you were to build, how that would impact, or both?
I think new construction is always the easy answer to this deal, but because it can be worked around. But no, I'm talking about I'm talking about buildings that are out there that are that again are right next door to residential, but they're industrial uses. I mean, it's heavily common, just the way our city was built, especially along the rail lines. To find that. And so, we need to know how, let's say, what additional enforcements we're going to see from the city if this is approved.
Yeah, so I'll take them kind of one by one. The noise, which should it be approved, the actual decibel level is at a 68 maximum. So right now, what it says is that's between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. So right now, as it's written, it would only actually apply in the industrial district. So there could be, if you were in a residential district and you had a DBH that was higher than that, then that could be regulated or would be regulated under this. The smoke and particulate matter, I don't think there would be any additional regulation on you for that. That's incorporates very much what is the federal EPA standard. So I don't think I would see any impact for you there. The vibration standards are pretty high. I think I could see an impact for you on the noise section. So what I would recommend is, take a look at that specific section. I'll read it right now for you. It says, no use shall exceed the noise level of 68 max dBA unless one of the following exceptions is met. And it says the noise emanating from, and this is actually just the construction, from the hours of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and then emergency devices. So I could see that the way this is currently written, that there would be some new enforcement in the noise section. I doubt that would property on the other two substantially, if at all.
Okay, so I'll add to that we do have a goal from our AEDC to have companies employing lots of employees, and there's multiple industrialized companies that are carrying 2 to 3 shifts during the day. So that plays into your hourly limitations that you mentioned. Naturally, we'd want to see that. I'd like to hear what you guys think as far as resolving that. But the only other thing that I could think of regarding I don't think vibration is an issue, but smoke and particulate, I know we ran into an issue where a crematorium in an industrial area was being pushed out because, and I could see where that could play into it, but otherwise I'd like to know an example, I guess, maybe of a smoke and particulate matter that would be of concern.
So one of the questions we had at a previous session, is a good question, and I think it can kind of help your understanding with this, is somebody asked, what's the difference between the air contaminant and a smoke and particulate matter? The smoke and particulate matter is very much the emissions of things that are harmful and things that the EPA regulates. So we're acknowledging it in the local code, but I don't see any actual additional regulations above what the federal government requires. The air contaminants, however, are when you're referring to just the odor and the fumes. And so the example that you gave me sounds more to that matter. And so under what we're currently stating, that you couldn't be cited for an impact in the residential district for that, because it would just apply in the industrial district only.
Okay, so what about the industrial uses that work more than, that try to have around the clock shifts, let's put it that way?
Yeah, that's a good one for the noise. I think there could be a clarifier in here. That's a very good point, because if the intent of this is for, non-regular loud noises, that those aren't causing a problem for the neighborhood. However, if you've had a long-standing use that it has a large employment base, that's not really what the regulation is designed to do. But I think we do need to, I think that's a very good comment, and something we could put some qualifying language in so that typical employment activities would not be cited in that case. But I agree with what you're saying in essence, and I think we can add some qualifying language to that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on that?
Doesn't look like it.
So moving into the historic section, some of this you currently have in your code, and so there's some part of it that you do. And so really our assignment was to refine this, to make this easier to use, to incentivize what's already in the code today. One of the key elements we were tasked with is looking at creating a process where a historic preservation overlay district could be created for a certain area of town. Currently, there is not a historic overlay district that's been designated within the city limits. The difference between the district and a historic landmark is the landmark is just that one individual building. So the intent of a historic overlay district is not to regulate or have an additional regulation on all buildings. It's only on those buildings that have a impact to what makes that district unique, if you will. So one of the thoughts on this is that as you may be aware of, the state recently passed a law that said that unless you have unless there's an exemption that applies, you can't apply any architectural standards. A city can't, or can't have any standards that developers have to meet. So, if you do have a historic district, that is an exception to that. And again, it would only be the contributing structures that would have these items connected to it. So the other section what we've talked about already on this call is the DOUDS, and that refers to the Downtown Urban Design Overlay District. We're really just bringing forward those standards. So with that, next slide. So currently, there's a committee that the city has. It's referred to as the Board of Review for Landmarks and Historic Districts. We think that name's kind of misleading, and it's in speaking with city staff, it's been kind of cumbersome, difficult, kind of wordy. So we've recommended in this draft to change the name to the Urban Design and Historic Preservation Commission. It's not only just a wording item, it's also when you look at the landmarks and historic districts, that really excludes the information that moves through this commission for the DO and the DOUDS connection, and that's more of an urban design type application. So it just doesn't reflect those responsibilities. And so for an average code reader, and in fact, as I was reading through it, your existing regulations, it was hard for me to understand at first, okay, what goes to this Board of Review of Landmarks and Historic District and what does not. The code wasn't very clear. So changing the name and making it clear what their responsibilities was a major portion of this work. Another item that we've connected this committee to is the Historic Landmark Tax Incentive Program. This is actually something that's on the books today for the city, but hasn't really been utilized. And so we want to, connect it in such a way that people can take advantage of this program. Basically, what it is that if you have a historic landmark or contributing structure within the historic overlay, if you go complete a submittal and show forward what you're going to do to historically revamp it, there's when I say it, the property, there's some rehabilitation, there's some costs and some tax incentives that go with that. So with that, the next slide. Just a little bit more on the historic overlay. area. One key element that I wanted to discuss is the certificate of appropriateness. So for minor applications under the way the new draft would be, or is drafted, is that for minor applications, it could just be approved administratively. You wouldn't have to go towards, or wouldn't have to go in front of any type of commission. It would just be something you would come in for staff and you'd get approval. However, the major applications would go through what we're changing the name to for the UDHPC. And then the next slide. Finally, on the historic landmarks, I mentioned about the tax incentive programs. The difference here with the COAs, however, is that for major altercations, it would work the same way as far as going forward to committee. But for minor alterations, there wouldn't even be a COA that would need to be required for that. So with that, I think it's a good stopping spot for questions on this item.
Mr. Salemi?
Yes. Fred, you should be able to speak now. Fred, you might try unmuting so you can speak. There we go. You're on, Fred.
I don't have a comment. I just punched this thing wrong. I'm on an iPad and so cancel me.
Well, you figured it out for when you do have a question.
All right.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Tim.
I guess my question is, thinking about the historic districts, I guess, the city hasn't really done a fiscal analysis yet, but I'm wondering if we have historic buildings or historic neighborhood zoning, setbacks, things like that, but it proves, if we ever did fiscal analysis, if we ever saw that it was actually tax negative, then meaning that it costs more to maintain all that infrastructure than the buildings themselves supply and tax basis or another revenue from the city. I mean, I'm just wondering if there's, if we're not preserving something that, while beautiful, is, slowly digging the city into a state of insolvency. I don't know. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that question at all.
I think I'll defer that to Chris or Andrew as far as the financial implications.
Again, this is Chris. We haven't done any kind of fiscal analysis, and it's kind of hard to gauge. I think it's a moving target, obviously, depending on the internal condition of the infrastructure of a building, perhaps the plumbing, the electrical, proposed use, stuff like that. So again, it just really depends on a case-by-case basis where that could be true or where it could be more beneficial to rehab the building with a particular use in the long run. Again, it's a moving target and nothing's really ever certain from that perspective anyways.
Did that answer your question?
Well, I guess the question was more about whether or not the development pattern itself whether the city could maintain that long term. So if you have huge lots with big mansions or something like that, I mean, generally, I think the older development pattern is more fiscally resilient than the modern generally, but
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to just say, I mean, I definitely have a soft spot for historic buildings, but I wouldn't necessarily want that to get into the way of maybe, other considerations like the fiscal viability of the city, essentially.
Yeah, I don't think, I think the city, the cities that have this type of provision with it for the tax incentives, they view it as a way to bring these buildings back to life. So they generally, and why I see a lot of cities look to enact this, is a way where the building is not currently being used. Or let's say you had a piece of property that didn't have a building, but maybe you could retrofit that piece of property to look and have the feel of the original building. It's a way of kind of incentivizing to bring more of your downtown back to life. So it's really more of a downtown revitalization incentive piece, I guess you'd say.
Okay.
Yeah, Tim, I would just say that this is an optional incentive. It's essentially an incentive program. It's optional for property owners. There's a lot of data out there that supports that cities that have used historic preservation overlays as a tool for preservation and revitalization see increased property tax value in those areas. And anywhere that this would apply would be, the oldest parts of Amarillo, which I think is, when you talk about strong towns and the importance of infill development and building where there's already infrastructure, I think anywhere that this would apply would be in those neighborhoods, those core neighborhoods that already have infrastructure in place.
Yeah,
So I think,
I guess the fear is
go
that,
ahead, Tim.
So I guess the fear would be that if they have to maintain, let's say, usually historic buildings are not, but let's say it was a single family, 1-story building. And if you said, well, maybe this could fit a 2-story duplex or something like that, but if it wouldn't meet the historic character, then it kind of cuts out the ability for the city to incrementally grow upwards if that's an area, something it maybe wants to do or developers want to do with it. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm on the fence about this, but I might not completely understand it either, to be honest.
Tim, I think your application really is more of a residential, the example you gave.
Mm-hmm.
And where I've seen the studies show the biggest impact for cities are really when they have a historic district that's in your downtown core, where it's a mixed use application, because it really brings business and new development. So I would say in the short term, I can understand, and the reason I originally deferred it to the city is, I don't know what the city's exact financial situation, because I'd say that on this you could have an impact in the short term, but in the long term, what the studies show is that it long term adds to the base, to the tax base.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
David, you had a chat and a comment from Wendy saying if you could elaborate on the comment you made regarding the state recently passing a law saying the city cannot have development standards that they have to meet.
Yeah, and if I misspoke and said development standards, let me change that. It's architectural standards. So when you're referring to types of requirements such as requiring masonry or requiring, a certain amount of the building front has to be a certain percentage of glass or windows. Unless you're in unless you're in a historic district that's been designated by the city and a few other exceptions, you can't regulate architectural standards based on a new state law that passed about a year ago. I think, does that clarify it for you, Wendy? I'm seeing Yes, thanks. Okay.
Go ahead, Gabe.
I think that's, so it sounds like, again, that architectural design standards would be enforced by city staff in an historic overlaid district. Am I understand that correctly?
Yes. As it currently stands today, there is no historic district. However, what we've drafted has created a process to which some could be designated and then created.
Okay, so that, I mean, it sounds like it would definitely be a deal of adding cost to the developers and whatever their ideas are. And I'm concerned about that because, you know, as my goal of every day of my life is to take blighted deals that people are ignoring or not occupying, more importantly, and breathe life into them. And that adds to the cost of breathing life into them, which means it could become it could become a scenario that people don't want to do it. They, you know, and yes, part of it is because they do want to build a cheaper structure, cheaper because they have to rent it for a capped value of rent. So it makes it very difficult to do so. I mean, is there some kind of incentive or something that you, I mean, that you see out there that would truly offset the cost of again, brick versus some other form of design?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the intent with the tax incentive program that's currently on the books that's really not being utilized, is to provide that incentive piece. I definitely understand what your point is, being that if the architectural standards are too high, that it's going to increase cost. As part of this, as part of the process that we've done for the city, you know, we haven't really fleshed out what those architectural standards would be because there's not even a designated location yet. So, you know, I think my main response would be is that in tax incentive program is the designed give and take with this here.
Okay, so I mean, of course, that's maybe where the staff chimes in, but I mean, is there districts that the staff would consider for this historic overlay district? I mean, is there certain areas of town that we'd be gunning for in this?
I'll defer that question to Chris and Andrew and Kelly as well.
Emily may have some thoughts.
Yeah, Emily, excuse me.
Yeah. Well, the city has done a lot of survey work. So there's a foundation for, you know, what neighborhoods would potentially be eligible. And this is completely voluntary. Like, this has to be something that the property owners within a district would bring to the city. I think we want to reiterate that this is a tool and an option. It's not something we're going to impose upon any neighborhood. And we can provide that survey information. The older residential neighborhoods are potential, you know, areas. Wolfland, Plymouth, Echo, San Jacinto would be. I mean, we discussed that during the planning process for San Jacinto, that commercial district is already a National Register historic district. So that would be an obvious one if the property owners along there wanted to utilize this.
Okay, so, you know, and again, dovetailing this back, you know, every time I've dealt with any kind of historic preservation, tax credits, anything else, it typically means that you're handcuffed to such high regulations that don't justify it. So do y'all see a code requirement, building code requirements that go with this that would be, I guess I'm trying to figure out if you put an overlay district in place, then does that mean the populace votes on what the
Gabe, did you,
requirements be?
let's just clarify the way that the overlay would be put into place. It, in most cases, would be triggered by a landowner who wants to designate their property that way. So it would be someone who probably would decide that the value of their property would be augmented by designation, unless the situation where the council comes in or staff comes in and recommends or imposes the overlay.
Is that a single owner, or, I mean, again, I'm trying to figure out why you'd create a district if there's a single owner. I mean, it'd have to be blocks of area that create a district.
Yeah, so there are two different items. There's the district and then the historic landmark. The landmark is that's usually going to be your individual landowner, so that's an easier type situation. Whereas when it's a district, it's much more of a public review process that the city's going to undertake before that designation.
I think one of the benefits of doing a district is if there's enough landowners that have buildings that could see the benefit of it, they can go in on it together, and then that helps them promote their properties or encourage their properties to be redeveloped in the future. Versus, say, like the Fisk Hotel or the Barfield, those were one-off historic projects. They knew they could do the project versus worrying about being in a district. But both of those took advantage of historic tax credit programs similar to this.
Okay, it still sounds like, codes would have to be developed around that specific district, and then, and I hope by the populace, but ultimately that would have to be added and met by the owners and users of that district. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, Gabe.
Okay, so I saw in the historic landmarks, there's a required where the COA is not required for minor alterations. It seems like that's been a major kind of hiccup with the city, with the staff to doing the COAs. So is there a way that we can, is that let's see, I think the way you put it was minor. Yeah, there it is. I'm looking at the minor modifications are not required. But the major ones are. I do understand that. Is that just for landmarks, or is that for the districts as well?
So for the districts, actually, if you go back one slide, Kelly, the minor for the districts are just approved administratively, so it would come to city staff, whether the major would go towards the commission.
Can we match that to the landmarks?
That's a very good comment. The one thing I will say that we need to look back on is, it's something I didn't mention, is that the state of Texas has a program referred to as the Certified Local Government Program, and it helps with certain grant monies that are available. The state does have certain standards for what the districts have to have. And so provided that's not one of the requirements, which offhand I'd have to go back and look. I'm more than happy to discuss that option with city staff.
I think if we can get it where there's, less regulation, the better. And that's why I'm just pushing for if a minor, whatever, not be approved administratively, but just be not requiring in the COA. But that being said, what is the definition between minor and major?
Yeah, sure. So for the HPO, the minor items that the planning director is authorized to review and approve are signage, landscaping, street lighting, sidewalk construction, minor modifications to the exterior of buildings, temporary construction facilities, buildings that are completely restored to their original state, or changes to civic space. Let's see. For the, and so that's what could be approved. The list I just mentioned is what could be approved under the current draft on a COA for a minor application, so that staff could approve all of those. For something that would have to go to the commission for either a landmark or for the district would be material changes in the exterior appearance of any existing contributing structure, whether it was an addition, alteration, or reconstruction. So basically changes on the front facade. And then the second item is if there was to be a demolition or of a building, that would of course have to go towards the commission. But as far as the site construction standards, that could either be approved completely administratively or without a permit in the case, or without any additional permitting that would be required. It would just be whatever's required for the site in that zoning district.
Yeah, I'd like to request that y'all change that to match the landmark deal where minor applications need not a COA.
Okay. So what I'll do on that, Gabe, is let me take a look at what the Texas CLG requirements are, and then I will discuss that with staff forward.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions on historic?
Not looking like it. Okay, well, before we get into the zoning map, we thought y'all might get a kick out of this page from Planning Magazine, the American Planning Association's publication. We were going through some firm files and found this from, I believe it was August of 1992, that talks about the city's vision for downtown and the beginning revitalization effort. So I just thought we thought it was kind of cool to see how far the city's come in the last almost 30 years. So the zoning map, Tyson mentioned this at the top of the presentation, that we are proposing some changes to the zoning map. A few of these slides will be a refresher from Module 1. This slide shows where we have new districts, the estate district, and then the 2 overlay districts. We've proposed consolidating some of the existing base zoning districts, and then we've made some revisions to the airport overlay, and I'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. The first one is the new estate district. This implements a future land use category and associated action strategies. The district is intended to be a transitional area between the agricultural and rural areas along the edge of the city and the more suburban areas. District consolidation. R2 and R3 currently share a lot of the same permitted uses, very, very similar development standards. So we've proposed consolidating these two districts into one that would be called R2. However, it would maintain the development standards for the current R3 district, and that's to help avoid any potential nonconformities that result from consolidation of these districts and essentially the rezoning. Then multifamily and office districts. This graphic here on the right, y'all may remember from the assessment, but it's just it shows the percentage of land area allocated to each of the zoning districts in the city. Multiple family 1 and then 2 and the office districts are not used very much, particularly the office districts in MF2. So we've proposed consolidating these into single districts. And then the 4 overlay districts. The first is the airport overlay. Like the city's sign code, the airport zoning regulations are currently in a separate chapter of the zoning code. And we've, since they're zoning, we've proposed incorporating them into the zoning ordinance. The regulations are largely carried forward. Our team has been working with the airport staff as well as the consultant that completed the airport master plan to make some revisions to the text to ensure that the airport is adequately protected based on its current operations. We are showing it on the zoning map now, and we will present the revised text to y'all in module 3. The downtown overlay, we've talked about it's being carried forward largely in its current state. We have heard from a few stakeholders that they'd like to see changes to the boundaries of the downtown overlay. However, at this point, we have not proposed any changes to the existing boundaries. Y'all have heard about historic preservation, and finally we've proposed a new urban neighborhood overlay district. We did talk about this in module 1, but at the time we were still evaluating the boundaries. This district provides for higher intensity multiple family neighborhood service and office type uses, and the boundary that's proposed on the zoning map I'll get ready to show you is essentially a ring around the central business district. So there is some overlap. I think there's some overlap with the Dodds. I could be wrong. Let me. So here's the draft map. Y'all can see here the downtown overlay in black, and then this sort of green hash mark around it is that urban neighborhood overlay. This large blue outline that covers a lot of the ETJ is the outermost boundary of the airport overlay district. We are working on some sort of sub-district maps to address different requirements in the airport overlay, such as the height zones. And again, we'll present those in module 3. I did want to call y'all's attention to the estate districts, which is this light green that you'll see along some of the edges of the city. The comprehensive plan future land use and character map recommends a number of properties for estate residential. And so those are the ones that we've proposed zoning as the new estate district. A lot of those properties are still outside the city's boundaries and in the ETJ. So there's just a few locations at the edge that would be rezoned into the estate district. I'm happy to take any questions on the zoning map. I can also pull up a PDF if y'all want to zoom in and look a little closer at any of the boundaries.
Good, Tim.
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't present for the Dodds district, but I am curious about, or I would be interested in reducing the Dodds district. You know, just as an example, going back to this project site that I mentioned earlier, I own property that's right along Adams Street and 6th Street. It's currently zoned in I-1, I think. And on the corridor along Adams, that's a 4-lane, 2-lane, one direction, 2-lane, the other direction street. And now the requirement would be, you know, planting trees and putting in streetlights, which may or may not fit anyways, but putting in streetlights along that corridor, I've witnessed personally 3 or 4 wrecks right at that intersection. The traffic speeds are like 40 miles an hour, sometimes higher. And it's also in an industrial district. Now I am about promoting new urbanism and walkability and all that, but I personally don't see that Dodds is really a great contributor to the goals I'm trying to meet, which is basically a bankable development project. So I'm just wondering, I'm wondering what the process would be to curtail the Dodds footprint. I mean, I think, let's say along Polk Street and a few other areas like that, right in the core CBD, it makes more sense. But to me, the farther out and the more industrial you get in the neighborhood, to me, the less it makes sense as a design style even, because it's like sort of colonial style lamp posting next to industrial lot buildings. So. I don't know if anyone can speak to that, but.
We may bring staff in on this one. We've discussed this. This came up during our meetings in February, and the decision was to leave the boundaries where they are. Staff want to jump in, or Kelly, do you?
I'm curious. I mean, what's the reasoning behind that? Is it just because those are the laws as they are? But I mean, what's the goal, the end goal behind it? Because I know of one property that's been developed to Dodge. Well, it's been partially developed to Dodge standards and is still sitting vacant. I know I have my site about 2 blocks away from that in a really rough area. And I just find the standards to really not meet the character of my block where it's at right now.
So Tim, your objection is not just the boundary, but the whole concept?
Well, I think more the boundary as it's applied in my area. Like I said, I think in the Polk Street area, in the downtown CBD area, it fits a little better. But like in my area, I'm next to a Miller Radiator Company. There's a bunch of different large industrial buildings, and then there's a couple of these sort of weird commercial buildings right in the corner. And there's a homeless shelter essentially right next to there.
Maybe we can trying to be more familiar with some of these street names.
Sixth and Adams.
Give some insight.
And then it's also next to like a road that's 40 miles per hour. So applying, pedestrian features on a road where I think, luckily I heard that the city would take on the responsibility of maintaining these things, but I've literally seen multiple wrecks right at this intersection.
Let's try to
high traffic speeds.
Let's see if we can get a response to your question.
So I don't see the benefit personally of it.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Well, I think overall, this is Chris, the intent of the downtown urban design standards, as you said, Tim, is to promote the urban feel, a pedestrian friendly environment. And of course it starts at the core of the downtown. And by having the boundary, the intent was to, over time, create that overall sense of place. We did talk about maybe in different areas of the downtown urban design district, maybe looking at varying design standards depending on their location. And I think what you're talking about is it's at the periphery of the downtown district where there is a lot of residential or industrial uses, where maybe some differing design standards or requirements could be warranted. And again, traffic safety issues come into play as well, depending on the location. So I think that's overall just to answer the intent of the downtown urban design district in a quick manner.
And if I can just make one follow-up comment, I would say really, I really urge the city to consider this. The cheapest and most cost-effective way, in my opinion, to drive increased urbanism and increased development is road diets and angled parking. You would immediately make pedestrians feel safer on the streets by slowing the traffic speeds, by making crossing streets easier, and you would provide more parking in a dense environment for development. And both those things are so important, and they don't even require a lot of infrastructure. They can just be changed with paint. And so really, to me, that is, I would say that should, in my opinion, if you're gunning for more urban redevelopment, that is where you start. And everything else, I mean, I'm willing to figure out how it all works for a development project because I believe in real estate urban development. But if the city would lead on road diets and angled parking, it would change so many things downtown, in my opinion.
Thanks, Tim. Got a couple more people who would like to jump in. Fred, we'll get to Gabe.
Don't want to intercede on Fred. Okay, so the angled parking is kind of contrary to the design standards for the Dowds. The Dowds requires more sidewalk space, which is, of course, the one thing that we've got to cut into in order to create the angled parking. So I would push for a diminishment of the Dowds and the design standards associated with it in order to provide parking, which is what we really most desperately need in downtown. By all means, I don't see the benefits of the Dowds, even though I was president of Center City and yes, campaigning for it at the time. But I will say that I did make my position clear when I was campaigning for it. But ultimately, the added costs that come from the Dowds, the delays, more importantly, that comes, well, added cost and time, add to, of course, the delays of commerce. And that's what we're consistently fighting with Dowds right now. I am absolutely in agreement with Tim's that if we reduce that boundary, and I think even Steve Rogers, I think at one of y'all's P&Z meetings, had made that commentary too, about if we can limit the Dowds and if we can put it more focused on the retail sector of Polk Street, maybe over to Buchanan, of course, 3rd to 10th or somewhere in those less industrialized zones. That's absolutely what I push for. I think that I think you'll have a whole lot less kickback from the populace on it if they see that. But of course, limiting it to that zone also touches on the reason why, which is the uses. The uses are a lot of the driving reason to even use the design standards or that overlay district. If you're doing a residential use, you want a little bit more residential feel. If you're doing a industrial use, you want security. You don't want, the non-barbed wire fence, let's call it that way. Yeah, because you're worried about your theft and, the lack of police protection. So I would push that you do reduce that and that it does not extend beyond Polk Street, worst case Tyler Street, and which of course is where WT is. But I would say that one of the major events of the Dowds and the overlay, by example, is signage, which was brought up earlier, in that, our signage is much more restrictive in the overlay than it is in anywhere in the city, all other places in the city for that matter. And if we can calm down those restrictions, and when I say calm down, I mean practically remove them, because I hate to be competing against Georgia Street or Washington Street that's a mile away when I'm trying to put a business into downtown. And yes, they absolutely use their advertising and signage as a point of contention coming downtown. Parking's the number one issue, of course. That being said, I do want to switch gears and ask the question of, on your estate districts, is that an application outside of the city limits line?
It's not.
Okay, it's just for those peripheral agricultural zone properties currently?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
That. Mr. Salemi, did you?
Yes,
what you
I've
did?
been preaching for years in which the downtown boundaries should be reduced to, say, Jackson on the west side, 10th Street, 3rd Street, and eastwardly past the Civic Center to the railroad. There's no reason in the world that the boundary should be Adams, and all of the area there, all you got to do is drive around. The buildings are deteriorating, and consequently, nobody can meet these standards for street lights, trees, what have you. There is really not that much foot traffic. As far as making it a beautiful area to sit around on the sidewalks and drink coffee, it ain't going to work. You're whipping a dead horse. It looks like World War II. And these meetings that you're having, you need to notify all of the property owners that we're having a zoning ordinance change. Your whole program needs to be postponed in order to send out a written notice, postcard, something to all property owners that the zoning change is coming. And let's have a real public hearing, even after the virus is over. There's no hurry on this deal because this ain't right. It ain't going to work. And that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on the zoning map? Okay. Well, Kelly, if you would just advance the slide there for me. From this point, we will move into module 3. If you'll advance it for me, Kelly. Over the course of the next few months, I would expect that we'll see you again in the September, October timeframe, and we'll be preparing a staff draft of module 3 and then preparing revisions and bringing those back to these groups that we did today, and then finalizing it for city council action. And what we'll do tonight is we have taken down your comments and your suggestions, and we'll carry those forward in the process and vet those first with staff and get direction on which ones to carry forward into the final zoning ordinance that will be taken for city council action. To Fred's point, you know, we're dealing with the COVID situation and limitations on getting this done face to face. So that's a bridge we are definitely going to have to cross as we get closer to the end of the project. And I think, Fred, your point is well taken about being in person. But there will be, you know, sufficient public notice and proper public notice before this is up for a decision. These meetings here are workshops to get initial public input so that we can make sure that what we take to the city council is reflective of what staff and the community recommend. If you have any comments after tonight, please do get them to Andrew and he'll get them to us if you have any in addition to those that were made verbally tonight. With that, Andrew, that's all we have.
All right. I think that covers everything. Appreciate everybody else tuning in via Zoom to try and work through these COVID times so we can get some engagement from everybody. So please be on the lookout for emails for the next meeting. Also, keep an eye on our website. We'll post this video and we'll also continue to update our FAQs as we get more questions to update the website. So hope everybody has a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.